They put a burlap sack over her head, tied her wrists with rope, and stood her on a wagon bed in the middle of Laramie like she was livestock. They called her Cursed. They sold her for $30 to a mountain man with whiskey-colored eyes who never asked to see her face. What none of them knew, not the auctioneer, not the crowd, not even the man who bought her, was that the woman under that sack was carrying a Circle T branded on her arm, a silver knife sewn into her corset, and a secret that was about to set the Bighorn Mountains on fire. Pull your chair a little closer to the fire, friends. This one is worth your time. The wind came down off the Bighorn Mountains, the way it always did in December, mean and patient, carrying snow that did not fall so much as it cut sideways through the pines. It was the winter of 1878 in Wyoming Territory, and a man could die between his cabin door and his woodshed if he was not careful. Up there above the tree line where the air thinned and the sky turned the color of beaten pewter, three brothers lived in a cabin their father had built with his own hands 40 years before. They did not know yet that a young woman in a red traveling dress was riding west on a train, gripping a worn leather valise and a folded letter that bore two different handwritings. They did not know that down in Laramie a man named Silas Thorne was paying a hotel keeper to drag her into the town square with a burlap sack over her head. They did not know that everything in their quiet, frost-bitten lives was about to be set on fire. But folks, that is getting ahead of the story. Let me tell it the way my grandfather told it to me, sitting beside his cast iron stove with a tin cup of coffee in his hand and the smell of pine smoke in the air. Pull your chair a little closer to the fire. This one is worth your time. They called it a joke. The men of Laramie, Wyoming, in the bitter winter of 1878, thought they were mighty clever. They decided to auction off a young woman with a burlap sack pulled over her head, calling her cursed, calling her ruined, calling her a thing instead of a person. They laughed when she stood there on the back of an old freight wagon, her wrist bound with a length of cheap rope, her chin somehow still lifted underneath that filthy cloth. They expected some drunk to throw down a few dollars and drag her home like a stray dog, but they did not know about the three Boone brothers, and they certainly did not know about Aurelia Hartwell. Sometimes the stone a man throws away is the diamond he has been searching for all his life. Quick word before we go further, friends. If a story like this means something to you, hit that like button. It is a small thing, but it tells the algorithm to share this campfire with other folks who need it. That is all I will ask. Now, Back to the mountain. In a cabin 2 days' ride above Laramie, a man named Elias Boone sat at a rough plank table near a stone hearth, mending a pair of buckskin gloves with sinew thread he had pulled from a winter killed elk. He was 33 years old, 6'5", broad through the shoulders, the way men who split wood every day of their lives are broad. His hair was dark chestnut, shot through with sun-bleached strands of caramel. His hands were the kind of hands that told their own story without him having to say a word. There was a long thin scar across the back of his left wrist from a Comanche lance at Adobe Walls. There was a burn mark on his right palm from the day he taught himself blacksmithing alone in his father's old forge. His knuckles were thick and crooked from honest work and from one bad fight he did not like to talk about. He set the gloves aside and lifted a tin cup of black coffee. His hand shook just a little. It was not fear. Elias Boone had stopped being afraid of most things a long time ago. It was memory. The memory of January last year, the winter of 1877, when the fever came down on him hard and fast like a falling tree. Holden and Thaddeus had been gone 3 days, south walking a trap line along the Tongue River, and there was no way to send word, no way to even crawl out of his bunk to feed the stove. He had laid there, with his teeth chattering and his vision swimming, watching the firelight die down to embers and then to nothing, watching the water in the bucket beside his bed grow a skin of ice and then thicken into a solid block. 10 days. He had laid there for 10 days alone, and when he finally came back to himself, the cabin was so cold that his breath had frozen on the inside of the window glass in feather patterns. He had survived only because the Lord saw fit to keep him and because Boone men were built out of something stubborn that did not give in easy. He could not do another winter like that. A man should not die alone in the snow with no one to know it but the wind. He looked out the small wavy window. The light was the color of old pewter. The clouds were piling up against the eastern peaks. Snow was coming, real snow, the kind that buried fence posts and sealed the passes for weeks. He set the cup down very carefully so the brothers would not see the tremor. Now, I want you to understand something watching tonight. That feeling Elias Boone had, that quiet dread of dying alone with no one to mark his passing, that is a feeling a lot of men know and do not say out loud. It is the feeling that opens this story. Hold on to it, because in a few minutes a young woman 3,000 miles away is going to write a letter that will answer that fear in a way Elias Boone cannot yet imagine. The cabin door banged open, and a wall of cold rolled in. Holden Boone stomped the snow off his boots on the iron grate his father had set into the threshold 30 years earlier. He was 31 years old, the middle brother, 2 years younger than Elias, and built almost identically, except for the easy half smile that never quite left the corner of his mouth. He carried a brace of snow hares slung over his shoulder and a folded square of newsprint in his hand. Behind him came Thaddeus, the youngest at 28, slighter than his brothers, his cheeks red from the cold, a leather-bound book pressed under his arm the way another man might press a rifle. Walt Whitman, Leaves of Grass, a volume he had carried up from Cheyenne the previous spring and read until the binding cracked. Brother, Holden said, dropping the hairs onto the table beside Elias's coffee. I have got an idea, and before you start yelling, hear me out. Elias did not look up. I have known you since the day Mamma brought you home from the midwife's bed. Every time you have started a sentence with that exact phrase, somebody has ended up bleeding. Thaddeus laughed quietly. Holden ignored him and unfolded the newsprint and slid it across the planks. It was a clipping from the Boston Globe 3 months old, the edges soft from being folded and refolded in his coat pocket. Across the top in heavy black type were the words, Brides Wanted. Below it, a column of small advertisements, each one a man somewhere in the territories asking for a woman to come west and share his life. We posted one, Holden said. Thad and I, 3 months back, through the Cheyenne post office. Used your name on it because nobody knows the Boone brothers like they know Elias Boone. Elias set down the sinew thread very slowly. He looked up. His eyes were the color of warm whiskey caught in afternoon light, but right now they had gone hard and flat as river stones. You did what? We posted an advertisement, Thaddeus said quietly, stepping forward so his older brother could not pretend he was not in the room. For a wife, for one of us, or maybe for the cabin, however Buddy wants to read it. We did not tell you because we knew you would say no. I would have said worse than no. That is why we did not tell you. Elias pushed himself up from the bench. The bench scraped backward across the puncheon floor with a sound like a complaint. He was head and shoulders taller than Thaddeus and a hand taller than Holden, and when he stood like that full height, the cabin seemed smaller for it. After Mama died, we made a promise, the three of us, by her grave on the south slope. No women in this house, not because we hate them, Lord knows we do not, but because every woman who has ever set foot in this cabin has been buried out of it. Mama, then Rowena. We are bad luck for them, Holden. We are a curse on a wedding ring. And you went behind my back and put a lure out for some poor girl in Boston who has no idea what she is walking into. Thaddeus did not flinch. He spoke softly, the way he always did when he was about to say something his older brother would hate. Brother, you almost died last January. We came home and found you blue as old iron and the cabin so cold that the salt in the cellar had crystallized. If we had been one more day, 2 more days, we would have buried you. And after we buried you, Holden and I would have come back up to this empty cabin and watched each other turn into ghosts. We posted that advertisement because we could not bear to lose you to a mountain that does not care. We posted it because this house needs a heartbeat that is not just the three of ours. Elias did not answer for a long moment. Outside, the wind picked up and made the chimney moan. The fire shifted, and a long ember cracked and fell into the bed of ash. What none of them knew what they could not possibly have known, sitting there in that cabin 2,000 miles from the brick streets of Boston, was that a young woman had read their advertisement on a cold morning in October. She had read it sitting at the dusty counter of her dead father's bookshop on Charles Street. She had read it twice, and then she had picked up a steel-nipped pen and written a careful, hopeful, desperate reply that she signed with the words, "Yours faithfully, Aurelia Hartwell." Now let us go back 4 months, friends, back to Boston, because to understand what was about to ride up that mountain, you have to understand what she was running from. Aurelia Hartwell was 22 years old in the summer of 1878. She had pale skin that took the sun poorly and honey-colored hair that her mother had brushed every night until she was 9, when her mother died bringing a stillborn brother into the world. She had 2 eyes that had come into this life mismatched. One, the bright cornflower blue of her mother, and one the deep storm gray of her father, an old country curiosity that the midwives in Hill had crossed themselves at when she was born, and never quite stopped whispering about. Her father had been a quiet, patient man named Walter Hartwell, who owned a small bookshop on Charles Street, 2 stories of dust and lamplight and the smell of leather bindings, a place where men of letters came to argue about Emerson and Thoreau, and where Aurelia had grown up reading whatever fell off the shelves into her lap. She had read Shakespeare at 9, botany manuals at 14, Walt Whitman in secret, because her father said Whitman was not for daughters, although he had not stopped her when he caught it, only sighed and gone back to his ledger. In the spring of 1878, her father caught a cough that did not leave. By June, he could not climb the back stairs without stopping. By July, he was bedridden. He died on the 14th of August with his hand in hers, and the bookshop ledger open on the desk beside CIM. $27 in unpaid bills and three letters from creditors weighted down by his reading spectacles. He had been her whole world. The funeral was small. The bookshop was sold within the week to pay debts, and on the afternoon of the burial, while she was still wearing the black crape and the lace veil her mother had been buried in 15 years before, her father's brother walked into her parlor. His name was Bartholomew Hartwell. He had not spoken to his brother in 11 years over a matter of money. He owned a brokerage house on State Street and wore a watch chain heavy enough to anchor a small boat. He sat down in her father's reading chair without being asked, and he laid a folded paper on the small table between them, and he said, "Aurelia, I have come to discuss your future." A week later he came back. This time he was not alone. The man with him was tall and broad, dressed in a black wool coat lined with marten fur, his beard trimmed close, his pale eyes the color of cold creek water. He was 38 years old, and he stood in her parlor as if he already owned it, which in a sense he soon would. His name was Silas Thorne. He owned cattle on the western plains of Wyoming Territory, the largest spread in the valley below Laramie, and he had come east to settle a debt and to take a wife back with him on the same trip. Aurelia, her uncle said, "This is Mr. Thorne. He is going to be your husband. Mr. Thorne has very kindly settled the outstanding obligations against your late father's shop in the amount of $200, in exchange for which he is taking you home to Wyoming." She stood up. She did not raise her voice because raising her voice was not how Hartwell women had been raised to fight. "Uncle Bartholomew, I have not consented to any such thing." Silas Thorne smiled. It was a small smile, a private one, the kind a man gives a horse he has just bought. "Your consent is not a relevant matter, Miss Hartwell. Your uncle is your legal guardian as of your father's death. He has accepted my offer. The wedding will be performed in Cheyenne the day we arrive, and then you will come up to my ranch, and you will be Mrs. Thorne, and that will be the end of this conversation forever." She looked at her uncle. He would not meet her eyes. That night she sat alone in her father's empty bookshop, and she made a list of every plant in the New England Botanical Compendium that could be eaten safely raw, and every plant that could not. She sewed a small leather sheath into the lining of her corset, and into that sheath she slipped a silver folding knife her father had given her on her 16th birthday for cutting pages out of bound proofs. She did not know what she was preparing for. She only knew that something was coming, and a Hartwell woman did not walk into the storm without something sharp. 2 days later, she boarded the westbound train at South Station with a steamer trunk and a brown leather valise and a man who called himself her husband to be. The wedding in Cheyenne was performed by a circuit preacher who did not look at her face. By supper time that same evening, she was in a buckboard wagon rolling north toward the Wyoming Valley, and Silas Thorne had not yet touched her, and she had begun very quietly to plan. For 4 months she was the lady of the Thorne Ranch. She kept the kitchen books. She mended his shirts. She sat at the long table at the head of the parlor and ate venison, and she smiled at his foreman, and she did not let her hands shake when Silas walked into a room. He had not yet in the language of the law, and the church made her his wife in the way a husband makes a wife. She did not know exactly why. She suspected he was waiting for some private reason of his own, some cruelty he was building up to. She prayed every night for the reason to keep delaying. Then a letter arrived from Boston in mid-October. It was from her oldest girlhood friend, a woman named Eleanora Pratt, asking how Aurelia was settling into her new life. Aurelia had read the letter twice and tucked it into her apron pocket and gone about her afternoon. And that evening Silas Thorne had walked into the kitchen with the letter in his hand. He had taken it from her apron when she was bent over the wood stove. He read the contents aloud in a voice that was very calm and very quiet, and when he had finished, he folded the letter and put it on the table. And he asked her in the same calm, quiet voice who Eleanora Pratt was, and what kind of woman wrote such intimate letters to another woman. She answered. He did not believe her. What happened next happened very quickly. It happened by the kitchen wood stove, with the smell of supper still in the air, and afterwards she could not remember the order of things, only that he had a folding knife in his hand that she had not seen him take out, and that it was suddenly across her face from her temple to the line of her jaw, a long clean stroke, and that the pain came after the blood, and that he was telling her very quietly that no man would ever look at her again the way he had once looked at her, and that she belonged to him now in a way she could not run away from because the world would see her face and know her for what he said she was, which was ruined. He locked her in the root cellar that night. The cellar was beneath the ranch house, 8 feet by 10, with a single iron grate at the top where a little snow blew in. She lay on the dirt floor with her face wrapped in a strip of her own underskirt, and she did not cry because she had decided in the bookshop on the night she sewed the silver knife into her corset that the women of her line did not cry on the floors of their captors. She lay there for 2 days. On the third night, the latch above the cellar door rattled and she heard the bolt slide. She heard Silas Thorne's foreman, an old, half-drunk man named Jed, mumble something. She heard him stumble away. The door was unlatched. He had forgotten. She climbed the wooden steps. She walked through the dark kitchen. She took her father's botanical book and her mother's cameo, and the silver knife from her corset, and a wedge of dried venison from the larder. She walked out the back door of Silas Thorne's house at 2 in the morning, with the temperature at 6 degrees below zero, and she walked 30 miles north through the snow to Laramie, navigating by the North Star, the way her father had taught her on the roof of the Charles Street shop when she was 11 years old. She arrived in Laramie 3 nights later, half frozen, half starved, with her face crusted in dried blood, and her dress black with it. She walked into the lobby of the Cottonwood Hotel and she asked the man behind the desk for sanctuary. The man behind the desk was named Clyde Mercer. He was a thin man with greasy hair and a mustache that hung down past the corners of his mouth. He owed Silas Thorne $300 in gambling debts. He sent a boy to ride for the Thorne Ranch the moment Aurelia closed the door of the room he had given her. Silas Thorne arrived in Laramie at noon the next day, and in front of half the town he announced that this woman, this poor wretched creature, was not his wife at all, but a mad woman from Boston who had stabbed her own uncle, and who carried the curse of madness in her blood, and who had come to Wyoming pretending to be respectable. He said her face had been marked by God Himself as a warning. He said he wanted nothing more to do with her. He said he would not even take her back as a servant. And he said with great public regret that since he had paid $200 for her hand and could not stand the loss, he would permit the town of Laramie to auction her off to whoever would have her, with the proceeds going to him as compensation for his pain. The town agreed. They always agreed with Silas Thorne. The auction was set for 3 weeks hence on the 15th of December in the town square, and Clyde Mercer was instructed to keep the merchandise locked in a back room of the hotel until then, and to put a sack over her head before bringing her out, so the buyers would not be put off by the sight of her face. Now, I am going to ask you to remember something while we go on. Aurelia Hartwell did not write that advertisement reply from Wyoming. She had written it back in Boston the previous autumn, on the night her uncle first came to her parlor with the folded paper. She had clipped the Boone advertisement out of the Globe because 3 names sounded safer than one. She had sent the reply to a post office box in Cheyenne under a false name, and she had paid the post fee out of the last coins in her father's coat pocket, and she had written across the bottom of the page that she would arrive in Laramie on the 15th of December, 1878, if the Lord saw fit to keep her alive that long, and she had not told a soul. She had not had time to send a second letter saying the marriage to Silas Thorne had been forced upon her, and that she might be coming under different circumstances. There had been no time. There had been no chance. The advertisement reply was 4 months old when it landed in the Boone brothers' cabin, and the woman who had written it had since been beaten and scarred, and locked in a root cellar, and now sat in the back of the Cottonwood Hotel with a sack folded on the chair beside her, waiting to be sold. Her uncle, 3,000 miles away in his Boston brokerage office, did not know any of this. He had pocketed the $200 Silas Thorne had given him, and he had then quietly arranged a second small piece of business with a Wyoming associate, which was that if his niece somehow came to harm out west, the small annuity her father had set aside for her in trust would revert to him as next of kin. It was a tidy arrangement either way. Bartholomew Hartwell was not in his own estimation a cruel man. He was simply a practical one. He did not lose sleep over practical things. Back in the cabin on the mountain, Elias Boone sat at the plank table with the Boston Globe clipping in front of him, and the second letter the trapper had brought up that afternoon, the one written in a hand he did not know, the careful hand of a young woman who had learned penmanship in a Boston schoolroom. He read it twice. The third time he read it slowly aloud so his brothers could hear. To the Boone brothers of Laramie, Wyoming Territory, I have read your advertisement in the Boston Globe. I write to accept your kind offer with the understanding that I am come west of my own free will with no debts to my name and no obligations behind me. I am 22 years old. I am of sound mind and good character. I read 3 languages. I have nursed my dying father, and I am not afraid of the work of a household. I will arrive at Laramie on the 15th of December of this year. I trust to the Lord and to your honor for whatever follows. Yours faithfully, Aurelia Hartwell. The cabin was very quiet. December 15th, Holden said. That is the day after tomorrow. Thaddeus turned slowly toward the window. And the storm is coming in tonight. The pass will be closed by morning. Elias folded the letter very carefully along the lines she had folded it. He set it on the table beside the globe clipping. He looked at the fire for a long time. Then he stood up and walked to the wall and lifted his bare fur coat down from its peg. I am going down to Laramie. Holden grinned. Thaddeus did not. You are going to send her back, Thaddeus said. I am going to do what is right by a woman who came 3,000 miles on the strength of three brothers' names. If she is decent and fair, I will tell her what we are and what we are not, and I will pay her a fair sum to ride back east in good health. If she is something else, I will know it and I will deal with it. But I am not letting some Boston girl freeze to death on a Laramie platform because we did not have the courage to face our own foolishness. You will not send her back, Holden said. I am telling you now. The minute you look at her, you will think of Mama or of Rowena, and you will not have it in you to put a woman alone on a winter train. Elias did not answer. He shouldered into the coat. He took down the Winchester 1873 from the rack above the door. He pulled on his fur-lined gloves and the wool muffler the color of old blood. He stepped out into the snow without saying goodbye, because Boone men did not say goodbye for journeys they expected to come back from. The ride down took the better part of 2 days. He slept the first night in a hollow under a leaning fir, his back against the trunk, the rifle across his knees. The chestnut stallion picketed close enough that he could feel its breath. By the second afternoon, he had cleared the pass and dropped down out of the deep snow into the broken country above Laramie. And by full dark, he was riding into the town along the rutted main street with his coat collar turned up against the wind. He stopped first at the railway depot. The station master, a thin man with a green eyeshade, looked at him from over a ledger. Boone. Yes, I had a young lady inquire 2 weeks ago whether anyone had come to fetch her. I told her no such party had come. She was put up at the Cottonwood by Mr. Mercer on Mr. Thorne's instruction, as I understand it. Elias's whiskey-colored eyes went still. Mercer and Thorne. The station master looked at his ledger and would not look up again. Elias walked out of the depot. The town square was 3 blocks east, a flat patch of frozen mud, surrounded by a saloon, a livery, a dry goods, the Cottonwood Hotel, and a small white clapboard church with a tilted bell. He could hear the noise of a crowd before he turned the last corner. He could hear Clyde Mercer's voice bouncing off the false fronts of the buildings, sing-song and theatrical, the voice of a man working a sale. He came around the corner of the dry goods, and he stopped in the middle of the town square on the bed of an old freight wagon turned sideways. For a stage, a young woman was standing. Her wrists were tied in front of her with cheap rope. Her hair was hidden. Her face was hidden. Her shoulders were hidden. All of her was hidden under a coarse burlap sack that had been pulled down over her head and tucked into the high collar of her dress. The dress itself was deep crimson red wool, traveling weight fitted at the waist, the hem dragged through with mud and old snow. There was a small black cameo brooch at the throat. The cuffs were edged in fine black lace. She was not bent. She was not crouched. She was not sobbing. Her shoulders were set square, and her chin, even underneath that filthy cloth, was raised. She was standing the way a woman stands when she has decided that the men around her will not see her break, no matter what they do. Clyde Mercer was on the wagon bed beside her, holding a paper in one hand and gesturing with the other. $5, gentlemen, only $5. A strong back, good teeth, 22 years of age, speaks English, reads even if anyone here values that. Yes, she has a small disfigurement, but I assure you, the sack stays on at no extra charge. You can put her to work in the kitchen and never trouble yourself with the sight of her. A few drunks laughed. A woman in a fur stole turned her face away. Somewhere in the back of the crowd, leaning against the porch post of the Cottonwood Hotel with his arms folded across his marten-lined coat and a small private smile on his face, stood Silas Thorne. He was watching the auction the way a man watches a play. He has written himself. $5, called the sodbuster from the front rank, his face red with whiskey. $7, called another. I need a girl to scrub floors. $7 and she is mine. 10, called a third. A freighter in a buffalo coat. $10 Mercer, and I will not even ask to see her face. Elias Boone stepped out from the corner of the dry goods. He walked across the frozen mud of the square. He walked through the crowd, and the crowd opened for him without quite knowing why. The way crowd opens for a tall man in a heavy coat, with a Winchester slung across his back and a particular kind of stillness in his eyes. He stopped in front of the wagon bed. $30. The square went quiet. Even the wind seemed to drop. Clyde Mercer's mouth fell open. He looked from Elias to Silas Thorne on the porch and back again. 30, Mercer said. $30, Spoon, you sure? You have not even seen her. I am buying her work, not her face. $30. On the porch of the Cottonwood, Silas Thorne uncrossed his arms. The small private smile was gone. Boone, Thorne called across the square. His voice carried easily in the cold air. This is no concern of yours. The woman is mine in law. I am simply recouping my expense. Elias did not turn his head. He spoke straight ahead to Mercer, but his voice was meant for the porch. She is standing on a public auction block in a public square, Thorn. Anyone with $30 in his pocket has business here, and I have $30. He pulled a small leather pouch from inside his coat and tossed it onto the wagon bed at Mercer's feet. The coins inside it made a heavy, honest sound against the boards. Sold, Mercer said weakly. Elias climbed up onto the wagon bed in one long step. He drew a folding knife from his belt, and he cut the rope between her wrists in a single clean motion. He did not touch the sack. "Walk with me, miss," he said quietly. She lifted her face under the burlap. He could not see her eyes, but he could feel her measuring him, the way an animal in a trap measures the man who has just lifted the latch. "You will not take it off here," she said. Her voice was clear and it was educated, and it was not what he had expected. "You will not let them see me." "No, miss, not here, not in front of these men. When you are ready, on your own ground, not theirs." She did not say anything else. She stepped down from the wagon. He walked slightly ahead of her, so that his body was between her and the eyes of the crowd, and he led her toward the post outside the dry goods, where his chestnut stallion and a borrowed second horse were tied. Silas Thorne stepped down off the porch of the cottonwood and into their path. "Boone, we will discuss this. The woman is legally my wife." "Then explain to me, Thorne, why your legal wife is standing on a public auction block with a sack on her head and a rope on her wrists. That is a private matter." "It stopped being private the second you put her on that wagon." Thorne's pale eyes flicked. For a moment, just a moment, Elias saw something move behind them that he had not expected. Recognition. Old cold recognition of the kind that passes between two men who have crossed paths once before in a way neither of them has ever told anyone about. But Thorne mastered it. He smiled the small smile again. "You think you have done a charity here, Boone. You will see before this winter is out what you have actually bought." "I will take that risk, Mr. Thorne, and I will say this, once and only once. If you or any man riding under your brand comes within 5 miles of my cabin, I will shoot him the way I shoot wolves. Not because I want to, because I have learned how a wolf thinks." He did not wait for an answer. He helped Aurelia Hutwell up into the saddle of the second horse. He swung up onto the chestnut. He turned both animals out of the square and toward the north road toward the long empty country between Laramie and the Bighorn Pass, and the snow began to come down harder, and the cold settled down onto the town like a hand pressing closed. Behind them, Silas Thorne stood in the middle of the empty square and watched them ride out. His face was very still. After a long moment, he turned and looked at a thin boy of about 13 who was standing on the porch of the hotel. Ride out to the ranch, Thorne said quietly. Tell my foreman I want 30 men, mounted, armed, ready to move when I say. The boy ran. They rode north for 2 hours without speaking. The light was failing. The wind was blowing the snow sideways. Now, fine, dry, the kind of snow that found its way into every seam and stitch of a coat. Aurelia sat the second horse, the way a woman sits who has not been on a horse much in her life, but who is too proud to ask the man ahead of her to slow down. Eventually, Elias did slow down. He angled off the road into a stand of black pines, into a hollow he knew from 20 winters of riding this country. There was a shallow rock overhang on the lee side. He swung down. He helped her down. He hobbled the horses and built a small, careful fire of pine pitch and dry needles, and when it caught, a few thicker sticks of split fir from his saddle pack. The fire bloomed yellow in the rock hollow. He sat down on the far side of it from her on a flat stone, and he did not look at her directly. Miss Hartwell, we have a long way to ride yet. You can take it off now if you want to. There is no one here but me and the horses do not care. She did not move for a long time. He thought she might refuse. He thought she might simply ride the rest of the way to his cabin under that sack, and that would be her right, and he would not press her on it. Then her gloved hands rose slowly, and she pulled the burlap up over her head and let it fall behind her into the snow. The fire was between them. The light caught her honey-colored hair, half pinned, half loose, around her shoulders. A face shaped like a heart, narrow at the chin, broad at the cheekbones, one eye the bright corn flower blue of her mother's people, one eye the deep storm gray of her father's. The eyes were a strangeness, a wonder, a thing that any God-fearing midwife in Beacon Hill would have crossed herself over. He had heard of such a thing. He had never seen it. And down the left side of her face, from the line of her temple to the line of her jaw, ran a long, clean knife scar, 4 months old, still pink at the edges, healing but not healed. She watched him watch her. She did not flinch. She did not turn away. She had decided long ago in the cellar at the Thorn Ranch that she would never again let anyone make her turn her face away from her own face. Well, Mr. Boone, she said, do I look cursed? He did not answer for a moment. Then he stood up and walked around the fire and crouched down in front of her, so that his eyes were on a level with hers. And he spoke very quietly. the way a man speaks to a startled horse. He does not want to spook. Miss Hartwell, I have seen men killed at adobe walls. I have seen women die in childbed. I have seen a friend of mine freeze to death 30 feet from his own door because the snow came up between him and the latch. I do not know what cursed looks like, but I know what survived looks like, and that is what is sitting across this fire from me. She did not answer. She could not. Something was happening behind her eyes that she had not let happen since the cellar floor of the Thorn Ranch, and she did not want it to happen in front of him, and so she turned her face very slightly toward the fire, and she let the heat of it dry whatever was rising before it became a tear because a Hartwell woman did not cry on the floor of her captor, and she did not cry on the snow in front of the man who had just bought her either. There is a man in Laramie, she said after a while, and her voice was level, who is going to come for me. He has 30 men and a great deal of money, and he believes I am a piece of property that has wandered off. I know. How? Because I saw his face on that porch, and I told him what I would do if he came up the mountain. He will come anyway, Mr. Boone. Then we will be ready when he comes. And it is Elias, miss, if you can stand to call me by it. Aurelia, then, if you can stand to call me by it. He stood up. He walked back around the fire and sat on his stone. They did not speak again for a while. The horses stamped quietly in the snow. The wind shifted in the pines above them. Somewhere far back down the trail toward Laramie, in the gathering dark, a single rider on a fast horse was already moving north along their tracks, scouting, marking the way for the men who would follow when the storm broke. Aurelia did not put the sack back on. She let it lie in the snow at her feet until the fire burned down, and then she picked it up and folded it with the care she would have given a piece of her father's linen, and she tucked it into her valise, because she had the feeling, although she could not have said why, that she would want it later, as a reminder, as a thing she had once been made to wear and had taken off and would never wear again. In the cabin, 2 days, right to the north, Holden Boone was sharpening the splitting maul on a whetstone by the fire. Thaddeus was reading aloud very softly from Leaves of Grass. The wind was building against the eastern wall of the cabin. Outside, the first heavy flakes of the real storm had begun to fall, the kind of snow that would seal the pass for 10 days, the kind of snow that would, in its way, lock everything that was about to happen up on that mountain together until it had finished happening one way or another. Thaddeus looked up from his book. Brother, Do you hear that? Wind. No. Listen. They both went still. Through the moan of the wind, through the settle of the snow on the cedar shake roof, very faint, very far away, came a single sound, the high, lonesome howl of a wolf on the south slope, the slope that led down toward Laramie. And then a long beat later, an answering howl from the north ridge. Holden set the whetstone down. They are talking to each other. Yes, they are. The two brothers looked at each other across the cabin in the firelight, and neither of them said the thing they were both thinking, which was that the wolves only talked like that when something was moving through their country that did not belong there. Something on the south slope riding north. Something that was on its way up the mountain. The storm broke over the Big Horn Mountains on the third night of their ride, and it broke the way storms break in that country all at once and without warning. One moment Elias Boone was leading the chestnut stallion up a switchback through the pines with Aurelia on the second horse behind him. The next moment the sky simply opened, and the snow came down so thick that he could not see the rump of his own horse, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in the span of a Hail Mary. He had been worried about this. He had been pushing them both hard for 2 days on a route he would normally have taken in 3. He had been right to push. He turned in the saddle and called back over his shoulder, his voice almost lost in the wind. Aurelia, stay close on me. Do not let the horse drift. If you cannot see my back, call out. I see you, she called back. Her voice was thin, but it was steady. Keep going. He kept going. The trail rose. The trail fell. The trail crossed a small frozen creek where the chestnut went through ice up to its hocks, and Elias had to dismount in waist-deep snow and hand lead them across, one at a time, his bare hand on the bridle, because gloves did not let him feel the bit. By full dark they had crested the last ridge. By the time he saw the yellow square of the cabin window through the blowing snow, his beard was a solid mask of ice, and Aurelia had stopped answering when he called back to her. He came up to the cabin door, and he hammered on it once with the flat of his fist. The door flew open. Holden was framed in the warm yellow light. The splitting maul still in his hand from the woodpile he had been walking when he heard the horses. Thaddeus was right behind him. They saw their oldest brother, and they saw the second horse, and they saw the small figure slumped over the saddle with her hands locked into the mane, and Holden dropped the maul and came out into the snow without a coat. Get her down, carefully. Her hands are frozen to the leather. They got her down. They carried her into the cabin between them. They sat her in front of the stone hearth on a low stool that Thaddeus pulled up close to the fire, and Thaddeus knelt and worked her gloves off, finger by finger, with the slow patience of a man undoing a knot in fishing line. And Holden brought a tin cup of warm broth from the pot that had been simmering all afternoon. And Elias stood in the open doorway with the snow blowing past him into the room, and he watched his two younger brothers tend to a woman they had never met before. And something inside him that had been clenched tight for 13 years let go very slightly, and he did not yet have a name for it. He shut the door. He set the bar. The storm howled against the cabin walls. The fire cracked and settled. Aurelia sat on the stool with her hands wrapped around the tin cup, the steam rising into her face, and she let her good cornflower eye close, and the storm gray one half closed, and her hair, half pinned and half fallen, caught the firelight and turned gold along the edges. The long pink scar caught the firelight, too. Holden looked at it once. Thaddeus looked at it once. Neither of them looked at it twice because they were Boone men, and their mother had raised them better. Miss Hartwell, Holden said gently, crouching down to her level the way Elias had crouched in the snow 2 nights before. I am Holden, the middle one, the one who wrote that letter. Then you are the one I owe my life to, Mr. Boone. Holden, just Holden. She turned her head slightly. Holden. Thaddeus, who had not spoken yet, found his voice. I am Thaddeus, the youngest. I helped him write the letter, although mine were the longer words, so if any of it was hard to understand, that is on me. The corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the first thing in 4 months that had come anywhere close. Your letter was kind, Mr. Boone. Both of your letters. There were two handwritings on the page. I noticed. I came west, partly because of the second one. Thaddeus colored to the roots of his hair and looked at the floor. Elias hung his snow-stiffened coat on the peg by the door. He hung his hat. He set the Winchester back on the rack above the lintel. He came over to the fire and stood behind his brothers, not crowding her, not looming just there. He looked down at her in the firelight. Miss Hartwell, this is the cabin. There is the loft up that ladder where you will sleep. There is the kitchen behind that wall where my mother made bread in 1856, and where no woman has made bread since. There is the front room where you are sitting now. There is the porch where I will sit tonight with my rifle across my knees because Silas Thorne is coming and we will not be caught flat. That is the cabin. The rest will keep until morning. She nodded. She did not argue. She drank the broth. When she finished it, she set the cup down very carefully on the hot stone and she looked up at the three of them, and she said the thing she had been turning over in her head for the last 40 miles of riding. Mr. Boone, Elias, I came west on the strength of an advertisement that named 3 men. I will not pretend I do not know what that means. I am not the woman I was when I wrote that letter. I have a husband by Wyoming law, who I did not consent to marry, and I have a face I did not have in October, and I have a price on my head that I did not have in November. If any of you wishes to put me on the train back east tomorrow, I will not hold it against you. I will only ask that you let me sleep one night in a warm room first. The three brothers looked at each other. Holden spoke first. Miss Hartwell, we are not putting you on a train. We are not even discussing it. Thaddeus quietly. No, ma'am, we are not. Elias laughed, his deep voice low and even. You are home, Aurelia. For tonight, anyway. The rest will keep until morning. She did not cry. She had decided on the wagon bed in Laramie that she would not cry in front of these men ever, and she did not. But she closed her storm gray eye for a long moment, and when she opened it again, the firelight in it was a little wet, and the Thaddeus Boone, who had read more poetry than was probably good for a Wyoming mountain man, thought he understood for the first time what Mr. Whitman meant when he wrote about a body containing multitudes. She slept that night in the loft on a thick mattress, stuffed with sweet grass and dried lavender that the brother's mother had laid down 22 years before, and that no one had slept on since. The sheets were clean. Holden had washed them in the creek that fall on a hunch he had not been able to name at the time. She slept with the silver folding knife under the pillow because some habits did not leave a person just because the door downstairs had a strong bar across it. She slept until full sunup. When she came down the loft ladder the next morning, the cabin smelled of coffee and bacon and something else, something herbal and clean that she could not immediately place. Holden was at the cook stove with a cast iron skillet. Thaddeus was at the table with a piece of bread and his Whitman. Elias was nowhere to be seen. He is on the porch, Holden said without turning around. He has been on the porch since about 3 in the morning. He came in once for coffee. He will not be in until the sun is full up over the eastern peak, and he can see down the south slope clear. That is how it is going to be for a while, miss. For how long? Until Mr. Thorne is no longer a problem, one way or another. She sat down at the table. Thaddeus closed the book and slid it to one side and looked at her properly in the morning light for the first time. And Aurelia, who had spent 4 months being looked at by Silas Thorne, in a way that made her skin crawl up off her bones. Found that being looked at by Thaddeus Boone did not make her skin do anything except settle a little more deeply into her shoulders. Miss Hartwell, he said, may I ask you something? Aurelia, and yes, that herbal smell, is that yours? She blinked. Then she looked toward the cook stove, where a small bundle of pale gray-green leaves was tied to a hook beside the spice tin. Sage, she said. Wild sage. I picked some yesterday morning while you were saddling. It grows along the lee side of a south-facing slope where the snow does not cover. I tied it up while we were at the fire. I thought you might use it for the bacon grease. It cuts the heaviness. Thaddeus stared at the hook for a moment. Then he stared at her. You picked sage while we were on the run from a man with 30 riders in a snowstorm. I did not have anything else to do. Mr. Boone and I have been putting sage on bacon since I was 9 years old. It seemed a poor reason to stop. Thaddeus laughed. It was a real laugh, the first real one Holden had heard out of his youngest brother in 2 years, and Holden at the cook stove, with his back to the table, smiled very privately into the skillet. The first week passed like the breaking of an old fever. The storm rolled through and rolled out, and the high blue cold settled over the big horns, the kind of cold that turned the air to glass and made every sound carry a mile. Elias slept in a bedroll on the floor by the door, with the Winchester within arm's reach, and the Colt revolver under the rolled coat that served him as a pillow. Holden moved the splitting block to a position where it was visible from the front window, so that whoever was on watch could see the other from inside. Thaddeus, without being asked, took down his father's old 1860 Henry rifle from the back wall, oiled it, sighted it on a nut in the smokehouse wall, and put it on the loft railing with 2 boxes of cartridges next to it. None of the brothers said the word ambush out loud. They did not need to. But while they were waiting for Silas Thorne, life in the cabin was finding a new rhythm, and Aurelia Hartwell was finding her place in it. The first morning she tried to help Holden with breakfast and burned the cornmeal so badly the smoke set Elias coughing on the porch. The second morning Holden showed her how to bank the stove. By the third morning her corn meal was passable. By the end of the first week she was making biscuits, the way Holden's mother had made them, light and flaky with bacon drippings folded in cold. And Holden, who had not eaten a biscuit like that since he was 8 years old, ate 4 of them in a row and then went outside and had to stand in the snow for a minute, looking at the eastern peak before he could come back in. She did not know how to dress out a deer. She did not know how to chink a log seam with clay and straw. She did not know how to mend a leather hinge, or how to skin a beaver, or how to read the difference between a cougar track and a big bobcat track. She learned. She learned fast. She had grown as she grown up reading her father's books on whatever subject crossed the threshold of the bookshop, and she carried that reading habit into the cabin the way another woman might have carried a trousseau. Within 10 days, she had read every book in the cabin, which were not many. The Whitman, a King James Bible, a 2-volume veterinary manual, an almanac from 1872, a field guide to North American medicinal plants that had belonged to the brother's mother and that Aurelia had quietly claimed as her own with the unspoken consent of all three sons. Thaddeus taught her to read sign because that was what Thaddeus did when he loved someone, although he did not yet know that was what was happening to him. He took her out behind the cabin into the long meadow that swept down toward the creek, and he showed her the difference between a deer print laid down clean and a deer print where the animal had been startled and pivoted, and he showed her how a wolf placed its hind feet exactly where its front feet had been, so its tracks looked like the prints of a single creature walking on two legs, and he showed her how to read the age of a track by the way the snow at the edge of it had crystallized or not crystallized in the cold. Aurelia listened with the steady, patient attention of a woman who had once read 3 botany manuals in a single Boston winter, and Thaddeus, watching her, thought that he would have read all 3 of those manuals himself if it meant he could have stood next to her in a Boston bookshop 10 years earlier. Holden taught her to ride properly because Holden had been on a horse since he was 4 years old, and he could not bear to watch her bouncing in the saddle the way she had bounced on the ride up. He took her down to the small flat below the cabin where the meadow leveled out, and he put her on the second horse, the buckskin mare, and he showed her how to sit deep on her seat bones and let her hips move with the animal instead of against it. He was easy with her. He was easy with everyone. That was Holden. He was the brother who could make a woman laugh at her own clumsiness in a way that made her feel somehow less clumsy. Aurelia laughed with him more in those 10 days than she had laughed in the whole of the year previous. Elias did not teach her anything. He watched. He watched from the porch in the morning while she fed the chickens. He watched from the doorway of the smokehouse when she came back from the meadow with Thaddeus. He watched from across the supper table while she listened to Holden's story about the time their father had treed a black bear in a pine and fallen asleep at the foot of it. He watched her, and he did not approach her, and he did not speak to her more than a sentence at a time, because Elias Boone had been married once before, and that woman was buried in the south slope behind the cabin. And the thing that was rising in him when he looked at the new woman in the firelight at night was a thing he was not ready to name out loud, perhaps not even to himself. Then, on the fourth day of the second week, Shrelia Hartwell did the thing that began the unraveling. It was a Sunday. Sundays in the Boone cabin were quiet. The brothers had been raised by a Charleston woman who would have whipped them with a willow switch for working on the Sabbath, and although she had been dead 18 years, the rule held. After breakfast, Holden was reading the almanac. Thaddeus was reading Whitman again on the front porch wrapped in a wool blanket. Elias had gone out with the Winchester to walk the south fence line because the Sabbath did not apply to a man with 30 hostile riders somewhere down the mountain. Aurelia, alone in the front room, had been straightening the shelves over the hearth. There was a long shelf of split fare that ran the length of the chimney piece, and on it lived odds and ends. A tin of cobbler's nails, a whetstone, a small bound book of pressed flowers that had clearly been a young woman's, and that Aurelia had not opened because some things were not hers to open. A jar of trade tobacco, and at the very back of the shelf, where her hand brushed it as she was wiping the dust away with a square of flour, sacking a hard rectangular object wrapped in a piece of oiled paper. She lifted it down. She did not open it. She did not need to. She knew the shape of a daguerreotype case under her hand, the way she had known the shape of her father's ledger book. She set the wrapped case back on the shelf. She did not look at the picture inside. But that evening, when Elias came in from the south fence with snow on his shoulders, and his face raw from the wind, and they had eaten, and Holden and Thaddeus had gone to bed, and the cabin was reduced to the orange pulse of the hearth and the slow breathing of three sleeping men, Aurelia came down the loft ladder in her wrapper and her stocking feet because she could not sleep, and she found Elias still awake, sitting on the long bench by the fire, with a tin cup of cold coffee in his hand and the wrapped daguerreotype case open on his knee. He did not look up when she came down. He had heard her on the third rung of the ladder and identified her by the weight on the wood, but he did not look up. She stopped at the bottom of the ladder. She did not retreat. Elias, I am sorry I should not have come down. Sit, Aurelia, if you would. She came around the hearth and sat at the far end of the bench, leaving a respectable Wyoming distance between them. He turned the daguerreotype case so that the firelight caught it. The image inside was of a young woman in a plain dark dress, sitting on a porch step, her hair pulled back, a small dark-eyed child of perhaps 2 or 3 years of age in her lap. The young woman was not beautiful in the way Boston portraits taught a woman to be beautiful. She was beautiful in the way a homestead morning was beautiful. Her smile was crooked. Her hand on the child's shoulder was square and capable. Her name was Rowena, Elias said. She was Scots-Irish. Her father was a Scotch trapper out of the Hudson's Bay Company who came south in 1848. Her mother was an Ulster girl whose family settled the Ohio Valley. Rowena grew up speaking 3 languages and could shoot a turkey through the eye at 100 yards. We were married in 1872 when I was 27 and she was 24. Aurelia did not interrupt. That child in her lap was not ours. She was Rowena's sister's child. We had no children of our own yet. We were going to. We had been married 3 years. He closed the case very gently. In 1875, the Indian Wars broke out hard along the Powder River. I had ridden cavalry as a young man the last 2 years of the Great War between the states, and I knew horses and I knew rifles. I was 30 years old, and I should have known better than to ride out again. But the territorial militia was raising men for the Powder River expedition, and an old captain of mine sent word, and I went. Rowena stayed at our place down in the valley below this mountain. We had not yet come up here. It was a small house, 2 rooms and a sod roof. Her sister and the child were staying with her while I was gone. He took a slow breath. I was gone 6 months. When I came back, the house was burned to the foundations. Rowena was in the dooryard. Her sister and the child were in what had been the kitchen. The story I got from a neighbor was that a band of horse thieves had come through white men, not Cheyenne, not Sioux, although that was what the territorial paper printed. They had stolen a string of horses out of Cheyenne the week before. Rowena had seen them on the road and recognized one of the brands. She was a witness. They came back. They killed her and her sister and the child. They burned the house. They rode west. The fire shifted. A coal rolled out onto the hearthstone, and Elias picked it up with his bare fingers and tossed it back without flinching. I took the brothers up here that fall. I buried our mother properly on the south slope where she had asked to be. I buried Rowena beside her. I made my brothers swear that no woman would set foot in this cabin as long as I drew breath, because every woman who had ever loved a Boone man had been buried out of a Boone house, and I was tired of digging graves on the south slope. He looked at her at last. Then I rode for 2 years. Not for trapping. I was hunting. I was hunting the men who had killed her. I found 4 of them. I do not regret what I did to those 4 men. although the Lord may take that up with me when my time comes. There was a fifth I never found. He had vanished. I came home. I made a kind of peace with not finding him. I told myself the Lord would find him when the Lord was ready to, and I have lived up here for 3 years on that thin piece. Aurelie sat very still, her good cornflower eye and her storm gray eye were both fixed on him. The hand resting on the bench between them had gone very pale at the knuckle. Elias, she said. Her voice was low. What was the brand? The one she recognized on the stolen horses. He looked at her and something in his face changed. It was a Circle T, burned on the left hindquarter. Why? She did not answer at first. She lifted her right hand. She turned it over. She pulled back the sleeve of her wrapper to the elbow, and on the inside of her forearm, just below the soft skin of her wrist, was a small old burn the size of a thumbnail. The skin had healed, white and slick. The shape of the burn when you looked at it the right way was a circle with a T inside it. He branded me, she said quietly, on my second night at the ranch. He said it was a joke. He said it was so I would always remember whose I was. He used the small iron he kept in the kitchen for marking calves out of the spring round. He held me down on the kitchen table and his foreman held my arm. I was 19 days into a marriage I had not consented to. I screamed. No one came. He said no one would ever come because the Circle T was Wyoming law in that valley, and the Circle T was Silas Thorne, and Silas Thorne was the man who had killed your wife in 1875 and taken the money he stole from those Cheyenne horses and bought up half the valley with it and changed his last name from whatever it had been before to Thorne after the bush his daddy was hanged from in Tennessee in 1859. The cabin went absolutely quiet. Elias Boone sat very still on the bench. He was not breathing. Then he breathed very slowly in and out, and he set the daguerreotype case down on the hearth, and he looked at the small circle T-burn on Aurelia Hartwell's forearm in the firelight, and he said one word very softly. How? How do I know it was him? Because he told me. He liked to tell me things after he had hurt me. He liked the sound of his own voice telling me things he had done. He told me about the woman in the valley. He told me about her sister. He told me about the child. He did not tell me her name, but he told me that her husband had been a cavalryman who rode out and never came home, and that the husband had hunted his old riding partners for 2 years and killed 4 of them, and that he, Silas, was the fifth, and that he had been waiting 3 years for the husband to come find him, And the funny thing he said, the funny part of the whole story was that the husband never had. She lowered her sleeve. She buttoned the cuff at her wrist with hands that did not shake because she had decided long ago that her hands would not shake in this cabin, no matter what she had to say. Elias, he sent me west to be his wife. He put a Circle T on my arm. And then 4 months later, when I read a letter from a girlhood friend, he took a knife to my face and locked me in his cellar. He bragged to me about killing the woman whose grave is on your south slope. I did not know that until tonight. I swear to you, on my father's name, I did not know. Elias Boone stood up from the bench. He walked to the front window. He stood there a long time looking out into the dark, where the moon was a thin sliver over the eastern peak, and the snow of the high meadow was the color of an old pearl. He did not speak. His hands were braced on the window frame, and his head was lowered between them, and Aurelia could see the long muscles of his back through his wool shirt, and she could see them shaking very slightly, and she understood that the man at the window was not simply the man who had bought her off a wagon bed in Laramie. He was a husband from 1875 who had ridden home to a burned house, and now, 3 years later, was discovering that the fifth man, the man he had given up on, had been one mountain over the whole time, branding his cattle and his women with the same small iron. She did not go to him. She did not have the right. She was a woman 2 weeks into a cabin who had not yet earned the right to put a hand on a man's back when his old grief had just become his new grief. She did say one thing, quietly from the bench. Elias, I want you to know, he has not made me his wife in the way the law and the church mean it. Whatever he did to my face and to my arm, he has not made me his wife. The marriage is unconsummated by Wyoming law and by the law of my church. It is voidable. I am not his. I never was. He did not turn from the window, but she heard him breathe once the long, shuddering breath of a man who had just been handed back a piece of himself he had not known he had lost. Aurelia. Yes, go up to the loft. Sleep if you can. Tomorrow we ride for Marshall Cole at first light. The fifth man is no longer mine to hunt alone. He is going to face a federal court for what he did in 1875 and what he did to you in 1878 and what he is about to do to all of us if we do not move first. Elias. Yes, he is not coming up the mountain in 3 days, the way his note said. He is coming sooner. He always moves sooner than he says. That is how he beat your wife to the witness stand in Cheyenne. Elias's shoulders shifted once. Then we ride before first light. She climbed the loft ladder. She did not look back at him. She lay down on the sweet grass thick mattress in the dark, and she put one hand under the pillow on the silver folding knife, and she thought about the burn on her arm and the scar on her face and the daguerreotype case on the hearthstone below, and she thought she should not be able to sleep. She slept inside 2 minutes. She had not slept like that in 4 months. Below her, in the front room, Elias Boone stayed at the window until the first gray of false dawn came up over the eastern peak. He did not weep. Boone men did not weep over things they could still do something about. He simply stood at the window with his hands on the frame, and he made a list in his head in the order in which it would have to be done. Wake Holden and the Tadeos. Saddle 3 horses. Leave the buckskin for Aurelia. Ride south by the lower trail, the one Silas would not expect. Stop at the homestead of Marshall Warren Cole, 27 miles down on the Sweetwater Fork. Show him the burn on her arm and the bloody silk Aurelia had taken out of Silas's safe. Federal warrant. Federal posse. Down to Laramie before Silas could move on the cabin. He did not yet know the thing he should have known, the thing he would learn at very high cost in the second hour after dawn, which was that Silas Thorne had not waited 3 days. Silas Thorne had not even waited one. Silas Thorne was already on the south slope, riding hard through the pre-dawn dark, because Silas Thorne had been a horse thief once, and the horse thief did not announce himself. A horse thief came at the dark hour before the gray when the dogs were quiet, and the rifles were leaning in the corner. But for now, the cabin was quiet. The fire was low. 3 brothers were sleeping or pretending to sleep. A young woman with a knife scar and a brand on her arm was sleeping for the first time in 4 months, without dreams. And the wolves on the south slope, who had been talking to each other every night since the auction in Laramie, were no longer talking. They had gone silent. Wolves only went silent for one reason, and that reason was that something larger than they were was moving through their country, and that they had pulled back to let it pass. On the porch of the Cottonwood Hotel, 2 days behind, Clyde Mercer was packing a small leather satchel with everything he could carry, because Clyde Mercer had decided 3 nights ago, looking at Silas Thorne's face across the saloon table, that whatever was coming out of this winter was not going to come out clean, and he intended to be in Cheyenne by the time it did. He was not going to make Cheyenne. He was not even going to make the next sunrise. But Clyde Mercer did not know that yet, and so he packed his satchel with the unhurried care of a man who believed he still had time, while 180 miles to the north, in a quiet cabin 2,000 feet above the timberline, Elias Boone was strapping on his gun belt and walking to the foot of the loft ladder to wake the woman who would, before the next sundown, have to learn how to use a Winchester for the first time in her life. Above the cabin, through the high pines, the first thin pink of true dawn was coming up over the eastern peak, and the air was so cold and so still that a man could hear, if he listened hard, the distant muffled sound of horses moving through deep snow on the south slope, 8 miles down and closing. Elias Boone laid his hand on the third rung of the loft ladder and stopped before he climbed it. He could hear her breathing up there, the slow, deep breathing of a woman who had finally let her shoulders down for the first time in 4 months, and a part of him, a part he did not entirely recognize, did not want to be the man who put his boot on the next rung and ended that breathing. But the wolves on the south slope had gone quiet, and the Boone man did not let a woman sleep through the thing that was coming up the mountain at her. He went up the ladder. She was already awake. She was sitting on the edge of the thick mattress in her wrapper with the silver folding knife open in her right hand, the blade catching the gray pre-dawn light from the loft window, and her mismatched eyes had the look of a woman who had heard the floorboards under his weight and decided in the half second between the first creak and the second that she was not going to be taken in her bed. Elias, he is moving. The wolves quit talking an hour ago. He is on the south slope, and he is closing. She closed the knife. She did not waste a breath on a question. How long? If he keeps the pace, I think he is keeping 3 hours, maybe less. We do not have time to ride for Marshal Cole. Cole is 27 miles south. By the time we reached him and rode back, this cabin would be ash, and we would be the people in the kitchen of it. She nodded once. Her hair was loose around her shoulders. She braided it back with her fingers in 3 quick motions while she was still hearing him, and tied it with a strip of leather she had been keeping under the pillow for exactly this reason. Then we make our stand here. Aurelia, you have never fired a Winchester? Then teach me before he gets here. He almost smiled. He did not have it in him to smile yet, not on this morning, but the muscle of it moved in his jaw the way a smile moves when it is trying. He turned and went back down the ladder. By the time the first true band of pink came up over the eastern peak, the cabin was awake and moving the way a cavalry company moves. 3 brothers and the Boston bookseller's daughter in a rhythm none of them had practiced and all of them understood. Holden barred the back shutters with the iron bars their father had forged in 1856 against exactly this kind of morning. Thaddeus carried his father's old Henry rifle, and 2 boxes of cartridges up to the loft railing, and laid them out in a row, and laid out beside them a third box of cartridges for the Winchester that Aurelia would carry, because Thaddeus had understood the moment Elias spoke her name. At the foot of the ladder that the woman his older brother had brought up, the mountain was not going to be tucked into a corner of the cellar while men did the fighting. Elias took Aurelia out behind the smokehouse, where the snow was packed hard, and the noise of the shots would not carry as far as the south slope. He put the Winchester in her hands. "Stuck against the hollow of your shoulder, not the bone. The soft spot just inside the bone, cheek down, on the comb of the stock, both eyes open. The front sight goes inside the V of the rear sight, and the front sight goes on what you mean to hit. Squeeze, do not pull. The rifle will tell you when it is going. Do not flinch when it does." She listened the way she had listened to Thaddeus, reading tracks in the meadow with the steady, patient attention of a woman who had once read 3 botany manuals in a single Boston winter. She put the stock against the soft place inside her shoulder. She breathed out. She squeezed. The stump of cottonwood 30 paces off shed a long pale splinter from the spot where she had aimed. Again she levered the rifle. She squeezed. The stump shed another splinter 2 inches from the first. Elias took a breath he had not known he was holding. "Aurelia, my father took me to a shooting ranch in Worcester when I was 15. He said a Hartwell woman should know how a thing worked, even if she never used it. I have not held a rifle since I was 16. I expected my hands to remember less." "Your hands remember plenty. Once more, then, we go inside and load every weapon in this cabin." She fired one more time. The third splinter came off the stump and lay in the snow alongside the first 2 like teeth. Then she lowered the Winchester and walked back to the cabin, because there was no point in spending more cartridges on a stump when the men they were meant for were 6 miles down the slope and closing. In the cabin, the 4 of them gathered at the long plank table. Elias laid out the situation the way a cavalry sergeant lays out a field plan, simple and clean, and loud enough that no one could pretend later that they had not heard. 25 men on the south slope, maybe more, coming up through the brush. They will hit the south fence between the smokehouse and the woodlot, because that is where the brush gives them cover up to within 50 paces of the cabin door. Holden, you take the front window with the 8 gauge. They will come in close to that door, and you will hold the door. Thaddeus, you take the loft with the Henry. You have the longest line of sight and the longest range. You do not waste a cartridge. every cartridge of yours is a man who does not get to the cabin wall. Aurelia, you take the kitchen window with the Winchester. You cover the woodlot side. If a man rounds the smokehouse, you put him down. Do not warn. Do not call out. Put him down. And you, she said, I will be on the porch. Silas Thorne is going to come through the front. He always does. He does not send another man through the door he means to use because that is who he is. I will be waiting for him. Holden looked across the table. Brother, there are 25 of them. There are 4 of us. The math is not on our side. The math is not on his side either. He has 25 men strung out on a switchback in deep snow with no cover. We have a cabin our father built to stand off Cheyenne War parties in 1856 and a clean line of fire down every side of it. The math depends on who counts it. I am counting. Thaddeus laid his palm flat on the table. There is one more thing. They looked at him. Thaddeus was the youngest. He did not interrupt his oldest brother's plans without cause. He thinks she is alone in the cabin with 3 of us. He does not know she can shoot. He does not know about the silver knife. He does not know what is on her arm. He thinks he is riding up to take a piece of property back. We let him keep thinking that until the second after he cannot. Elias looked at his youngest brother for a long beat. Then he reached across the table and laid his big calloused hand briefly on the back of Thaddeus's slighter one, the way their father had laid his hand on theirs when one of them had said something worth saying. We let him keep thinking that. Yes. The first shot came at 9:15 in the morning. It came not from the south slope where Elias had placed every man, but from the long ridge above the cabin to the northwest, where Silas Thorne, who had been a horse thief, once had sent 5 men around a long way during the night to take the Boone brothers in the back at the same moment he hit them in the front. The 30 riders the boy had carried orders for in Laramie had become 25 on the south slope and 5 on the north ridge, and that division was the second mistake Silas Thorne had made before sunrise. The first shot punched through the kitchen window and shattered the blue enamel coffee pot on the cook stove. The pot was empty. Aurelia, who had been standing behind the kitchen wall, 5 feet from where the bullet entered, did not panic. She did not call out. She set the Winchester on the kitchen sill, sighted on the puff of black powder smoke that hung in the still air above the ridge, 220 paces off. Waited the long 3 count for the man to lift his head again to see what he had hit and squeezed. The man on the ridge dropped his rifle and sat down very slowly in the snow, and then lay back as if he were tired. He did not get up. In the loft, Thaddeus saw the second shooter move on the ridge to fire on the muzzle flash from the kitchen window, and Thaddeus, who had been a quiet boy in Charleston and a quieter boy on this mountain, and who had read more poetry than was probably good for a Wyoming rifleman, settled the Henry's brass front sight on the second shooter's chest and breathed out. The Henry coughed. The second shooter went down on top of the first. Then the south slope opened up. They came out of the brush at the south fence, the way Elias had said they would, 20 riders abreast, with Silas Thorne 3 lengths ahead on a tall blood bay horse, his marten-lined coat thrown open, a Spencer carbine across his pommel. He was not yelling orders. Silas Thorne never yelled. He simply rode at the cabin the way a man rides toward something he believes is already his. Holden Boone, at the front window, lifted the 8 gauge and took the lead rider on Thorne's right. At 30 paces, the 8 gauge took off most of the man and most of the saddle and a large piece of the horse's withers. The horse went down screaming. 2 horses behind it tangled in the kicking legs of the dying one and went down too. Thaddeus in the loft fired the Henry 3 times in 7 seconds and put down the riders on the far flank, the ones swinging wide to come around the woodlot. Aurelia in the kitchen picked up a fourth man who tried to round the smokehouse on foot with a torch, and she did not warn him, and she did not call out, and she put him down the way Elias had told her to. Silas Thorne reined up at 50 paces from the porch, and he saw the 3 brothers' rifles, and he saw the kitchen muzzle, and he heard the loft Henry, and he understood for the first time that the cabin had 4 shooters, not 3, and that one of them was a woman who was not supposed to know which end of a rifle the bullet came out of. The pale eyes, the color of Cold Creek water, flicked once toward the kitchen window. He did not need to see her face. He saw the barrel, and he saw the steady way it was being held, and he understood that whoever was on the other end of that rifle was not afraid of him, that more than the muzzle itself was what stopped him cold. The woman he had branded on a kitchen table in October was supposed to be afraid of him for the rest of her life. She was not. He smiled, the small private smile that did not reach his eyes. Aurelia, he called across the snow, come out. I will not harm a hair on your head. Come out, and the Boone brothers live. She did not answer. Elias Boone stepped out onto the porch. He had the Colt revolver in his right hand holstered, the holster loose. The Winchester was leaning against the porch post within reach of his left. He had no coat on. He was wearing the wool shirt he had slept in and the same dark trousers he had ridden up the mountain in 2 weeks before. The sun was full up over the eastern peak now, and it caught the side of his face and the long thin scar on the back of his left wrist and the broad square set of his shoulders. And he looked for a moment exactly like a man his father had been 30 years before. On a different porch, on a different mountain, facing a different rider who had come for something he should not have come for. Silas Thorne, he said. He did not raise his voice. The cold morning carried it. Elias Boone. You are 8 miles inside my fence line. You have brought 25 men onto my land with the stated intent of taking my wife. She is not your wife, Boone. The marriage in Cheyenne preceded yours by 4 months. By Wyoming law, she is mine. By the law of her church, and by the law of her own consent, she was never yours. The marriage was unconsummated. The contract is void. You know that. You have known it for 4 months. The reason you cut her face in October is because you knew that very fact, and you could not bear it, and you decided that if you could not have her, you would mark her so that no other man would. It did not work, Silas. I bought her in your auction. I am keeping her. And you and I have one more piece of business between us before this morning is finished. What business is that, Boone? Powder River, 1875. A burned house. A woman in the dooryard. Her sister and a child in the kitchen. A Circle T branded on a string of stolen Cheyenne horses you sold to a man named Bell in Casper a week later for $640. I have been hunting the fifth man in that party for 3 years. You are the fifth man. For the first time in 20 years of riding under a name that was not his, Silas Thorne's face moved. He did not speak for a long moment. The blood bay under him stamped once in the snow. The remaining riders behind him, perhaps 15 of them still mounted, sat very still because they had been told they were riding up a mountain to recover a runaway wife from 3 trappers, and they were now hearing their employer be accused in plain daylight in front of all of them of the murder of a cavalryman's wife 3 years before. You have no proof of any such thing, Boone. I have her arm. Whose arm? The arm of the woman in the kitchen window. She has a Circle T branded on the inside of her right fore arm, where you put it on her second night at your ranch. The same iron you used on the Cheyenne horses in 1875, the same iron. I will take her arm to a federal court in Cheyenne, and I will lay it next to the seized stock from the Bell sale, and a federal judge will read the match in 2 minutes. He paused. The sun was on his face. His whiskey-colored eyes did not blink. I also have the silk handkerchief, the one with my wife's blood on it. the one you kept in your safe at the ranch as a souvenir. Aurelia took it the night she walked out of your cellar. It is folded in her valise. I will take that to the same federal court." Silas Thorne lifted the Spencer carbine off his pommel. He did not lift it to fire. He lifted it the way a man lifts a thing he is no longer sure what to do with. His free hand, the left one, slid down very slowly toward the ivory butt of the navy colt at his hip. In the kitchen window, Aurelia Hartwell sighted the Winchester on his chest. She did not fire. She waited. She had decided during those 3 shots into the cottonwood stump that she would not fire on the man who had put the brand on her arm until he had drawn first. Not because the law required it. The law of Wyoming required nothing of the kind, but because she did not want the rest of her life to start with a shot fired into the back of a man who had not yet committed to drawing on her husband. She wanted the rest of her life to start clean. She wanted Silas Thorne to choose. He chose. His left hand cleared the holster faster than a man his age had any right to move. The Navy Colt came up. It was not aimed at Elias. It was aimed at the kitchen window. He had decided in the half second since Elias had spoken about her arm that the woman in the kitchen window was the only piece of evidence he could not afford to leave standing. 3 shots fired in the same instant. The first was Aurelia's. It took Silas Thorne in the upper chest, just inside his left collarbone, and turned him a quarter of the way around in the saddle. The second was Elias's. The Colt revolver came clear of the holster and went off level at the hip, and the round took Silas Thorne in the throat. The third was Silas Thorne's. The Navy Colt fired as his hand jerked, and the bullet tore through the kitchen window an inch above Aurelia's head and buried itself in the flour barrel behind her, and she did not flinch. Silas Thorne sat in the saddle for a moment longer. The blood bay stood very still under him the way a horse will stand under a man it knows is no longer giving it instructions. Silas's head came down very slowly onto his chest. Then he slid sideways, the way a man slides off a saddle when there is no longer anyone driving the body, and he hit the snow under the horse's hooves on his left side, and he did not move again. The broad bay shook itself once and walked riderless 15 paces out of the line of fire and stopped. The 15 riders behind Silas Thorne sat on their horses and watched their employer lie face down in the snow with his marten-lined coat spreading dark around him. And then one of them, a young man at the back, dropped his rifle into the snow in front of his horse. And then the man next to him dropped his rifle, and then another and another, until all 15 of the remaining Circle T men had laid their long arms in the snow and lifted their hands to their hat brims to show they were empty. They were not loyal men. Silas Thorne had never paid them well enough for loyalty. They were simply men who had been told a story about a runaway wife and three trappers, and had now learned in the space of 2 minutes that they had been told a different kind of story altogether. Elias Boone stood on the porch with the Colt revolver smoking in his right hand. He did not lower it for a long count. Then he holstered it. He walked down off the porch into the snow. He walked past Silas Thorne's body without looking at it, and he walked to the kitchen window and he stood under it and looked up at the Winchester barrel that was still resting on the sill. Aurelia, I am here, Elias. Come out, please. The morning is over. She came out. She came around the corner of the cabin with the Winchester held muzzle down at her hip, and her braided hair was loose at the temples from the kick of the rifle, and the cornflower eye and the storm gray eye were both on his face, and she walked across the snow to him and stopped 2 paces away. Is he gone? He is gone. You are sure? I am sure. She set the Winchester carefully on the porch step. Then she walked the last 2 paces to him. She did not look down at the man in the snow. She did not need to. She looked instead at Elias, and she said the words she had been turning over in her head since the moment she sighted the rifle on Silas Thorne's chest, and she said them quietly for him alone, but loud enough that the body in the snow might have heard them if there had been any hearing left in it. Thank you, Mr. Thorne. Thank you for showing me who you were before it was too late. I am free now. Then she did the one thing she had not done in 4 months, the thing she had refused to do on the cellar floor, and had refused to do on the auction wagon, and had refused to do under the burlap sack, and had refused to do across the fire in the rock hollow. She put her face against the front of his wool shirt, where the smell of pine smoke and horse and blacksmith iron was strongest, and she let go of the thing she had been carrying since August. Her shoulders shook once. She made no sound. She had decided long ago that a Hartwell woman did not weep where men could hear it, and she did not break that promise even now. But the front of Elias Boone's wool shirt grew wet under her good cornflower eye, and her storm gray eye, and his big calloused hand came up between her shoulder blades and stayed there, and that was how Holden Boone and Thaddeus Boone, coming down off the porch with their long guns lowered, found their oldest brother 3 minutes after the morning ended. Holden walked past them without speaking. He walked out to where Silas Thorne lay face down in the trampled snow, and he turned the body over. with the toe of his boot, and he looked down at the pale eyes that were open and seeing nothing, and he said one word very quietly to the corpse, "Mama." Then he walked away. Marshal Warren Cole rode up the south slope at 2:30 in the afternoon with 8 Federal deputies behind him and the warrant for the arrest of Silas Thorne folded in his coat. He found 4 bodies on the ridge to the northwest where the loft, Henry, and the kitchen, Winchester, had spoken in the morning, and 7 bodies on the south fence where Holden's 8 gauge and Elias's Colt had spoken later, and 1 body in the trampled snow in front of the porch where Aurelia Hartwell and Elias Boone had answered Silas Thorne together. He found 15 disarmed Circle T men sitting in a line on the long bench beside the smokehouse, with their hands on their knees, and he found Sheriff Nathaniel Holt of Laramie County riding 20 minutes behind him on his way up to investigate, and he arrested Sheriff Holt before Holt had finished dismounting on a federal charge of taking bribes from a man wanted for murder in Cheyenne. He stood on the porch with Elias Boone. He looked out at the long line of bodies and the long line of disarmed men. "Boone, you know I am going to have to take statements from every soul on this mountain." "I know. It is going to take 3 days." "It is going to take as long as it takes Marshall. We have biscuits." Warren Cole, who had ridden with Elias Boone in 1875 and had been a quiet half-drunk widower for most of the years since, and had ridden up this morning the moment word reached him that something was moving on the Boone Mountain, turned his face toward the eastern peak so that Elias would not see what was on it. Then he turned back and he held out his hand and Elias took it. "Aurelia Hartwell," Cole said. "May I speak to her?" "You may, Marshal. She is in the kitchen." The marshal took her statement at the long plank table. He took it slowly, and he took it carefully, and Aurelia laid out in the clear, unhurried voice of a Boston bookseller's daughter the whole long story, from the parlor in August to the cellar in October to the auction wagon in December to the morning that had just ended. She unbuttoned the cuff of her sleeve and showed him the Circle T on her forearm, and Cole looked at it for a long moment, and then he wrote 1 line in his notebook and underlined it twice, and that 1 line, when it was read 3 weeks later in a federal court room in Cheyenne, was the line that hanged the memory of Silas Thorne and restored the names of Rowena Boone and her sister and the child to the historical record of Wyoming Territory. She gave him the silk handkerchief from her valise. He folded it into oiled paper and put it in his coat pocket, and he did not speak for a moment. "Miss Hartwell," he said at last, "I knew Rowena Boone not well. I met her twice. She was a good woman. Marshal Cole, from everything Elias has told me, I think she would have liked me." "Yes, ma'am, I expect she would have." He stood up. He went out to begin the long work of taking the bodies down the mountain. 3 days later, the cabin was empty of strangers again. The bodies were gone. The 15 Circle T men were riding south under federal escort to be tried, and almost all of them released because most of them had not known what their employer was. Sheriff Holt was riding south in a wagon with his hands tied. Marshal Warren Cole was riding south with the silk handkerchief folded into oiled paper in his coat pocket. 3 weeks after the federal hearing in Cheyenne, a letter arrived at the cabin from a Boston law office. Bartholomew Hartwell, brokerage owner of State Street, had been arrested on a charge of fraudulent conveyance of his late brother's estate, brought by federal authorities at Marshal Cole's request, with statements from Aurelia and her late father's attorney as evidence. The annuity her father had set aside for her, and which her uncle had quietly arranged to inherit if she came to harm out west, had been restored to her name in full, and she now had $850 in a Cheyenne bank account that she had no immediate use for and no intention of spending until she did. She wrote her uncle one short letter on the day the news came. It contained 2 sentences. "I am alive. You are not coming near me again." She did not sign it. She did not need to. On the first night, the 4 people in the cabin sat down to supper without a long gun within arm's reach. Holden cooked. There were biscuits on a plate in the center of the table, and a venison stew with wild sage in it, and a small jar of huckleberry preserve that had been a wedding gift to the brother's mother in 1854, and that Elias had pulled down from the back of the high shelf without comment that afternoon. When the plates were cleared, Elias stood up from the table. He walked to the front door. He opened it and looked out at the porch where the morning had ended and where Marshal Cole's deputies had scrubbed the boards with snow and lye until you could no longer see what had been spilled there. "Aurelia." "Yes." "Will you walk with me?" She rose from the bench. She took down her shawl. From the peg by the door, the one Holden had given her on her second day in the cabin, the soft one of carded wool, dyed deep crimson red, the color of the dress she had worn down the mountain, and she stepped out onto the porch with him, and he closed the door behind them. The sun was setting behind the western peak. The sky above the eastern ridge was the color of an old pearl with one streak of pink at the bottom. The air was very cold and very still, and smelled of pine smoke and the snow, and very faintly of the wild sage Holden had put in the stew. He did not get down on his knee. Elias Boone was a man who would have felt foolish on his knee, and Aurelia Hartwell was a woman who would not have wanted him on his knee. He simply stood in front of her on the porch boards with his big rough hands at his sides, and he spoke the thing he had been turning over in his head since the moment her face had come out from under the burlap sack in the rock hollow 2 weeks before. Aurelia, I am 33 years old. I have one wife buried on the south slope, and another 4 months of the worst kind of marriage to undo on your record. I have a cabin and 2 brothers and a chestnut stallion and a forge that does not see enough work. I do not have a Boston parlor, and I will not learn to dance. I have killed men in war, that the Lord may yet take up with me, and 4 men I hunted down for Rowena, and one more this morning, and I do not regret the last 5. I am not by any honest measure a soft bargain, but every morning since you came up that ladder in your wrapper and your stocking feet I have woken wanting to know what you would say at breakfast. And every evening since the rock hollow I have gone to sleep on the floor by the door, knowing you were 6 feet over my head in the loft and being unable to think clearly for a quarter of an hour about anything else. I am a Boone man, and I do not say things twice, and I do not say things to fill the air. So I will say this once. Will you stay? She looked at him in the pearl-colored light, the cornflower eye and the storm-gray eye held his whiskey-colored ones for a long moment, and the long pink scar caught the last of the sun, and she did not lift her hand to cover it, because she had decided up in the loft on her first morning in this cabin that she would never again cover any part of her own face for the comfort of any man. She did not need to. Elias, when I was 19 years old, my father gave me a copy of Mr. Whitman's Leaves of Grass and told me to hide it from my aunts. I hid it in the hat box where I kept my mother's cameo. I read one line of it every night for 2 years, the way another girl might read the Psalms. There is a line in that book that says, I will not have a single person slighted or left away. It is the only line of poetry I have ever loved enough to live by. When I stood on that wagon in Laramie under the burlap sack, I told myself if I lived through that hour, I would only ever choose a man who saw me before he asked to see my face. You did. You waited. You took me out into a rock hollow in a snowstorm, and you let me lift the sack myself. Yes, Elias, I will stay. And it is not because you asked me. It is because I had already chosen you the night you put your knife through that rope on a public auction block and did not by so much as a glance ask the crowd's permission for it. He closed his eyes for one breath. Then he opened them and he reached into the pocket of his wool shirt and he took out a small ring he had been making in the forge. For 3 nights running, when he could not sleep and that no one in the cabin had asked him about. It was not gold. It was hammered silver from a Mexican peso of his father's, with a thin band of the dark iron from the broken horseshoe of the chestnut stallion welded into the inside of it, so that the silver and the iron held each other together the way her good eye and her storm gray eye held each other together in her face. He slipped it onto the fourth finger of her left hand. She looked at it. She did not speak. "It is not a Boston ring," he said. "It is not a Boston hand any more, Elias Boone." He pulled her in against the front of his wool shirt, and he kissed her there on the porch. In the last of the light, one quiet, careful kiss, the way a man kisses a woman he intends to spend the rest of his days kissing properly and at his leisure, and she kissed him back, and the sun went down behind the western peak. The cabin door opened a respectful 3 inches, and Holden Boone's voice came through it without his face. "Mama always said a porch courtship gets cold by the second hour. There is coffee on you too when you are ready." The door closed again. Aurelia laughed against the front of Elias's wool shirt, the first true laugh he had heard out of her, and Elias Boone, who had not smiled in earnest since the spring of 1875, smiled into the top of her honey-colored hair, where the last of the sunset was catching it and the dark came up the eastern slope, and the wolves on the south slope, who had been quiet for 3 days, began to talk to each other again, easy and unhurried, the way wolves talk when the country has settled back into the shape they know. They were married on the 5th of May, 1879, in a clearing on the south slope above the graves of the brother's mother and of Rowena, by the Reverend Ezekiel Whitfield of Laramie. Holden stood up with his brother. Thaddeus read 3 lines of Whitman that the Reverend pretended not to recognize. Marshal Warren Cole rode up from Cheyenne with a bottle of Kentucky whiskey and a federal court paper formally dissolving the unconsummated marriage of Aurelia Hartwell to a deceased man named Silas Thorne, and the paper was burned in the wedding fire after the vows because a Hartwell woman did not keep a marriage paper from a man who had branded her even after he was 3 months in the ground. Aurelia wore a plain white dress she had cut and stitched herself out of muslin the brothers had ridden to Cheyenne to buy, and her mother's cameo at her throat and a small bunch of wild lupine that Holden had hiked 4 miles up the eastern ridge at first light to gather. Elias wore his father's black wedding coat 25 years out of fashion and the small silver and iron ring on the fourth finger of his left hand. When the Reverend asked her if she took this man as her husband, Aurelia turned her face very slightly so that the pink scar on her left cheek caught the May light, and she did not turn it away, and she said the word the way a Hartwell woman said a word she meant. I do. A golden eagle came up off the eastern peak as the Reverend pronounced them and circled the clearing once and turned west toward the big horns and was gone. None of the 4 people standing in that clearing said a word about it. They did not need to. Mountain people in 1879 understood exactly what was being said. That night, when the door of the cabin closed behind Elias Boone and his bride, the front room was quiet and the fire was banked low, and the loft above was empty for the first time in 15 years, because Holden and Thaddeus had ridden 3 miles down the slope to sleep at the homestead of a neighbor as a kindness to the new marriage, and there was no further sound that the mountain or this storyteller had any right to speak of, and so I will not. Some doors close, my friends, and what is on the other side of them belongs to the 2 souls behind it and to the Lord who made them, and not to me and not to you. When morning came, the snow on the high ridge was already softening at the edges, and the long winter that had begun the night. A man on a porch in Laramie sent a boy to call 30 riders was finally properly over. Now, folks, most stories end at the wedding. This one does not. Because the question a man my age asks sitting beside the stove with his coffee going cold is not, did they marry? The question is, did it last? Pull a little closer to the fire. I will tell you what came after. 15 years passed. The cabin grew. Elias added a second room in the spring of 1881, when Aurelia gave him twin sons, born on the same May night under the same midwife's hands, and they named the older boy Elijah for his father's father, and the younger one Callum for the Scotch trapper who had been Rowena's father, because Aurelia said a man should carry forward the names of the good people who had gone before, even the ones he had never met. Aurelia would not have it any other way. 4 years later, a daughter came. Aurelia named her Rowena Hartwell Boone, and Elias did not say a word against it, only walked out to the south slope at sundown and stood by the grave for a long time and came back inside and held the baby in his big calloused hands and called her by her full name, because a woman who had named a daughter for the woman before her was a woman who had understood the whole of him. Holden married Constance Whitfield, the Reverend's daughter, in the autumn of 1881. They had 4 children of their own and built a smaller cabin 3 miles down the slope, and Constance taught the schoolhouse in Laramie 3 days a week. Thaddeus left the mountain in 1882 for Yale Divinity School on money. Aurelia put up out of the annuity her uncle had tried to steal, and he came back 5 years later as a Methodist minister and took the pulpit at a small church on the Sweetwater Fork. He wrote a book in 1894 called The Sack Covered Bride, a frontier memoir, and it sold 50,000 copies in 3 printings, and Aurelia would not allow her own name to appear on the cover, only Thaddeus's, because she said the story did not belong to her alone. Marshal Warren Cole rode up the south slope every Christmas Eve until 1897, when his horse came home without him on a January morning, and they buried him beside Rowena and the brother's mother on the south slope, because he had asked in his quiet, half-drunk way to be buried with friends. And then the years went the way years do, faster after 50 than they had any right to. Now, I want you to picture something with me. It is the autumn of 1923. The cabin is still standing. The roof has been reshaked twice. The forge is quiet because the man who used to work it is 78 years old, and his hands no longer hold an iron the way they once did. On the porch in a chair Elijah Boone built for his father out of split oak sits Elias Boone. His hair is full white. His shoulders are still broad. The whiskey-colored eyes are softer now, but they have not lost their quiet. Beside him in a smaller chair sits Aurelia. She is 67 years old. Her honey-colored hair is white at the temples and silver at the crown. The long pink scar on her left cheek has faded almost to a thread. She has never once, in 44 years, lifted a hand to cover it. 3 small children sit on the porch boards in front of them. Meredith, 6, Elijah's oldest girl. August 4, Cordelia, 2, with one cornflower blue eye and one storm gray eye, the only one of the grandchildren to have inherited it. Grandma, Meredith asks. She has been walking up to it for an hour. Why do you have that mark on your face? Elias does not interrupt. This is Aurelia's question to answer, and he has known for 44 years that she would answer it the only way she knew how. She lifts her old hand. She lays it gently along the line of the scar. It is a sign, sweetheart, a sign that I lived through something, and a sign that your grandfather loved me not in spite of my face, but because of who was behind it. Elias reaches across the small space between the two chairs and takes her hand. The hand is thinner than it was. It has held 3 babies and a Winchester and a silver folding knife and the ledger of a Wyoming homestead for 44 years, and it fits inside his, the way it did the first night on the auction wagon in Laramie when he cut the rope that bound it. You are the only miracle this old man ever needed, Aurelia Hardwell Boone, and you are the only family I ever needed, Elias Boone. Cordelia, the smallest, who is 2 years old and does not yet know what the words mean, climbs up into her grandmother's lap and lays her head against Aurelia's shoulder, and the cornflower eye and the storm gray eye close together in the late October light, and the wolves on the south slope who have been talking to each other every winter for 44 years are quiet because the country has settled long since into the shape it was meant to. They called her Cursed, once friends. They put a sack on her head and they laughed. They put her up on a wagon bed in a frozen square in Laramie and they sold her for $30. But sometimes the stone a man throws away is a diamond he has been searching for all his life. And Elias Boone, the man who had once been so afraid of dying alone in the snow that his hands shook over a tin cup of coffee, never had to be afraid of that again. Two broken people fitted together perfectly to make a whole. That is all love ever has to do. This has been Marcus Friends from the Campfire. Thank you for sitting with me tonight. If the story moved you, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm to share this fire with the next folks who need it. Subscribe. And I will tell you another one next week about a widow on a stagecoach and the man who got off at the wrong stop. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your fires burning.